This is James Zucker, your teacher for AP World History and teaching AP World History, especially with the new framework that's taking place. Now, I know this summer there's going to be a lot of anxiety and a lot of tensions and frustrations about the fact that there are changes that are taking place in the AP World History framework. Here's the good news. So, a lot of these changes have already taken place, as you probably know, in AP US History and AP European History. I have the fortunate opportunity to teach AP US History as well as AP World History. And when the changes took place in AP US History, I looked through the framework, and they're the same changes that are taking place in AP World History. And what we've noticed is, the truth is, and here's the good news, you're already doing all of this. Truth is, we already teach all the material that's in the AP World History framework, whether you're teaching the old framework or the new framework. The issue really is much more of an emphasis and an issue of being more conscious about the overall thinking skills and the overall historical themes that we tend to teach in the class. So the good news is you're already doing this. Now what we need to do is just make sure we are adapting to this new framework and that we're very conscious about it and lay it out very clearly for our students. So, first big thing that's really important about the new framework is the emphasis of a change from facts to higher order thinking skills. Now, by higher order thinking skills, what I'm talking about are all the big thinking skills that you probably are already teaching in your classes and have been teaching in your classes for some time. Now we're just being more conscious about these higher order thinking skills. Now, a lot of teachers will say, oh, so in other words, the College Board is saying facts don't matter. No, not at all. Facts do matter, but they just have a different focus than they used to have. Facts in the past used to be emphasized. A lot of times we would look at them as sort of discrete facts that you could be tested upon. But now what we're really using facts more are used to illustrate the main higher order thinking skills. Also, the curriculum is now broken up into significant themes that you want to teach throughout the course, whether you teach them thematically or if you teach them within units. And the test now has changed as well. In the past, the test was very much a balance between multiple choice and writing. Now the test really has changed much more to analysis and with a huge emphasis on writing. The multiple choice itself, which is for AP World History actually is not a huge change, is about analyzing readings. Now you will notice there is a change that's taken place in AP World History. In the past, what we had in the old test were several of the traditional multiple choice questions that were based on higher order thinking skills, and then there would be some readings that would be interspersed with one or two questions afterwards. That's no longer the case. Now all of the multiple choice is going to be about analyzing readings. You'll have a reading and then you'll have about 4 to 5 multiple choice questions afterwards. Most of the test is going to be broken down, though, into writing sections. There's a short answer section, a document-based question, and a long essay. And we'll go over those both in this PowerPoint and in future PowerPoints about how to approach those. So, the time periods. As you'll notice, the time periods really have not changed. They're pretty much the same as we've always had them. So there's really not much here that we need to look at in order to make a big difference in the way that we've been teaching in the past. And that's really the good news. In fact, for me, the way that I teach the class is that I teach it as period 1 being human beginnings, period 2 being the classical age, and period 3 also being in that time period of the classical age, but then transferring really into the post-classical age. Period 4 being the modern age, period 5 being the age of industrialism and imperialism, and then period 6 being the time period of the 20th century. So this is very similar to what we've already been doing in the old test. There's not a lot to have to worry about here, and not too much to have to be anxious about. However, here is where we do start to see some of the changes. The changes come with themes. So one of the big themes is the interactions between humans and environment. For me, in the way that I teach the class, we talk about whether or not environment determines human choice or if human choice molds the environment. And of course, for me, and I think for most of us, we usually come down to it's usually not either or, it's both and. Humans, especially during the human beginnings, humans oftentimes were determined by the environment, but from the beginning on out, humans' use of technology always ended up shaping the environment. The development and interaction of cultures. This is where we get into the diffusion of cultures and we start to talk about how different religions were formed and how those religions influence different cultures, how beliefs about gender and race and class have interacted and shaped cultures. We also get to talk about how trade overlaps and impacts cultures. State building, expansion, and conflict. So some of the big themes that we start to see through this is the development of centralized governments, how leaders consolidated power, built militaries, built economic systems, and how they influence people, but also how reform movements from the bottom up influence governments. The creation, expansion, and interaction of economic systems. This is probably one of the biggest themes within the class about how different economic systems and trade relationships, which have existed since the beginning of human relationships, have had impacts on how human culture and human governments have been formed. And then last up, the development and transformation of social structures. So here we get into hierarchical issues, gender issues, race issues, and class issues, how different cultures have interacted with each other, and how that has created relationships between different groups of people. So the other big change is the higher order thinking skills. Again, in one sense, this is not much of a change, especially for AP World History. I think for the AP US guys, there was a little bit of a change that took place, not because they weren't teaching this, they were teaching it, but they just didn't break down their course in this particular way. For AP World History, this is very familiar to us. A comparison and contrast, very similar to what we've done in the past as far as the comparison and contrast essays. Cause and effect, this is basically the change in continuity essay, but we now have broken it down to several possibilities. So change in continuity, basic cause and effect, and also something called periodization or turning points within history. And then, of course, we get the document-based analysis in which we look at documents in context. We question whether or not documents, what was their audience, what was the author, and what was the point of view of the document. And then there's a new skill called synthesis that we'll be going over about how do we make connections to other time periods and other places within history. So, on the concept outline, the course description takes the time periods and it connects them to these themes and higher order thinking skills. The concept outline is going to provide a framework for the major ideas that you teach in the class. Now, one of the big things I want to point out here is that the concept outline has examples inside of it. Some of the examples are required. Other examples are just there to illustrate the issues of the class. So what does that mean for you in teaching the class? What I would suggest is as you look over the concept outline, and I have provided a summary of the concept outline in this first week, I've gone through each one of the major time periods and I've laid out a summary of each one of the major ideas in the concept outline. Take the things that are required and then build out from outside of them of things that you would like to teach in the class. I know it's very hard to teach everything, but we have to be very careful of pacing. So if we use what the College Board has provided as being the basic stuff that has to be taught, then we can use other examples to illustrate the main issues in the class, and you can use what you feel most comfortable in the time that you have. So keep in mind, again, some of the concepts are required, others are just suggested. The point in all of this is don't get bogged down in the details. What really is important is that you're teaching your students on a regular basis the bigger themes and the thinking skills of the class. So here are the big changes to the test. In the past, as you probably remember, the old test, just from last year, was multiple choice, 70 questions in 55 minutes, and that counted for 50% of the test. A document-based question, students had 40 minutes to write that, and that counted for 15% of the test. Change continuity essay, 40 minutes, 15% of the test, and then we finished up with comparison contrast essay, 40 minutes, 15% of the test. Now you notice here that there's a really big balance between the multiple choice and the writing section, but look at what happens in the new test. In the new test, there are multiple choice, there are 55 questions in 55 minutes, and these multiple choice questions now are no longer discrete multiple choice questions. They are basically based upon what are called stimulus or a primary or secondary source. Students are asked then to analyze those sources in about 4 to 5 multiple choice questions. That's 40% of the test. They're then going to have a short answer section, which they answer 4 questions in 50 minutes, and that's 20% of the test. A document-based question, 1 question in 55 minutes, 25% of the test, and then 1 long essay in which they get 2 choices. They get to choose one of those 2 choices, and they go ahead and write that out, and they have 35 minutes for it, and that's 15% of the test. Notice what's happened in the new test. In the new test, there is a huge emphasis now on writing that overwhelms the multiple choice section of the test. So, on the multiple choice. The old multiple choice, like I was saying before, was a critical thinking question with 5 possible answers to it. Now what we have is a primary or secondary source reading with 4 possible answers. And the questions are not about comprehension of the passage. Rather, what the students are going to have to do is use the higher order thinking skills to analyze the reading. Next up, on the short answer section. The short answer section is very similar to multiple choice. Students are going to get a primary source, a secondary source, or a graphic image. They then are going to get a question broken down into 3 sections. That's true for AP US and AP European. In AP World, you might actually see a question broken down into 2 sections. So it's possible for 2 or 3. I would suggest giving your students practice questions that are 3 sections just so that they get used to doing that. The students are going to have to address each question separately. Here's the good news. The students do not have to provide in-depth answers that go on and on and on. All they have to do is answer the theme of the question and the higher order thinking skill that's being asked directly. So expect the following pattern. This is what I've noticed that happens again and again on these short answer sections. Not always, but typically happens. First, they're asked to summarize a passage. Then they're asked to give a brief example for support, and then a brief example for dissent. So this is an example of what I'm talking about here. And notice again, sometimes there are 2 possible questions. Sometimes there are 3 possible questions. I would suggest getting the kids just ready to do 2 sections. So here we have some historians have argued the adoption of agriculture during the Neolithic period and the adoption of industrial production during the 19th and 20th centuries are the 2 most important transformations in world history. So notice here they're already kind of setting you up for a possible comparison and contrast between these 2. So A, identify and explain 2 shared results of both transformations that would support the historian's assertions. So here we have, again, that support idea. Identify and explain another transformation in world history can be interpreted as being of equal or greater importance. So in this particular one, what we have here is a support for it, and then B actually gets into that new skill that we're going to talk about, which is called synthesis. So notice what's happening. It's not that they're expecting them to go into a huge amount of depth for each one of these answers. They need to identify the historical thinking skill and provide a quick 2 to 3 sentence answer that directly answers that question. The document-based question. So here's the good news. We will always know from here on out, document-based questions are always going to be 7 documents from here on out. So in the past, it used to be between 8 to 12 documents. Now it's only 7. Why do they make it 7? Because they know the students are going to have to do more with these 7 documents, so they give us a very clear description of how many documents the students are going to have to analyze. So like in the past, students must provide a thesis that answers the prompt. But here's the big change. They're going to have to analyze the documents, and they have to analyze them using one of the following. So they don't have to analyze all the documents using all 3 of these, nor do they have to use the same technique for every single document. They can choose from these 3 that are here. Talk about the audience, talk about the author's point of view, or talk about the author's purpose of the document. The student then must provide contextualization and historical context. Now, I know this is going to get a little confusing, and you're going to wonder what the difference is between these 2, and I'll explain that in a future slide, so don't worry about that. We're going to talk about some of the tough issues with a document-based question, but just keep in mind that this is what they have to do. And then last up, the students must provide a synthesis, which I'll also explain about how that works. So let's go over that. What are the tough ones for the DBQ? And especially for AP US history guys and for AP European history teachers, they've really experienced what the tough ones are in teaching and getting the students to do it. So here are the tough ones. First of all, under the thesis point, you're going to notice that there's a second point that they give on the rubric, and it's called the corroborating or dissenting views point. Now, all this means is this. In AP US History and AP World History, there's been a divide for some time in grading. And in AP World History, we're very familiar with this because we were the ones who developed this whole notion of doing what's called dimensional scoring grading is what they're calling it now. Asset grading is another name for it that's been called in AP World History, where we give singular points for different types of skills. You probably remember this from the old test. In AP US History, they did something called holistic grading. They would take a look at the overall essay and they would categorize it in which section they thought it was, if it A, B, C, D, or so forth. What they did was they seemed to have provided this particular point on the rubric as a way to sort of be a compromise for those people who are on the holistic side. So what it means is this: it's not really a point for the thesis, it's a point for the overall essay. Do you think the essay goes beyond just providing an argument? Do you think it provides overall coherency and organization? And do you think it does the work to corroborate its argument or to provide a dissenting viewpoint and then outweighing against that dissenting viewpoint? So in many ways, this is sort of like the expanded core that we used to have in the old AP World History test. So when you're looking through and you're trying to give this grade, don't get confused by this and think it's an extra point for the thesis. It's really sort of like that expanded core. Do you really think this is an excellent essay that goes beyond just the minimum of what students have to do? The other big problem that I know teachers have is contextualization versus historical context. How do we make a difference between these two? So here's the analogy that I use. Imagine that you're in an airplane and you're flying way high above the clouds. You're looking out over the horizon and you see the big picture. That's contextualization. Big picture issues and trends that influence a particular historical context. Now, let's say you land on the tarmac. You're looking out and you see trees and you see people walking around. You see all these specific details on the ground. That's historical context. What were the specific events that ended up influencing the document that you're talking about? And last up, and this is a really tough one for teachers, is synthesis. How do we teach kids how to do this kind of skill? And what exactly is this new skill that they have put into the AP classes? So there are 3 possibilities actually in AP World History for what you can teach the students. My favorite is the first one, and that's a parallel with another time period. I like this because I think it makes most sense to students. Students tend to think of history this way, that we study history to learn about things from the past. So it's a very clear way to teach students to make a synthesis or connection with another time period. If you want to, there is another way you can teach this, and that is to have the students discuss an issue not asked about in the question. So if the question asked about politics, students can talk about politics in the essay, but then at some point address economics and how that influences, or ideology and how that influences. That will gain a synthesis point. There is a third possibility in AP World History. Imagine that the question is talking about slavery within the trans-Saharan area, and a student decides to, at the end of the essay, talk about how this related to slavery within the Haitian context. That would gain synthesis as well. Here you're talking about another geographical context that's not asked about directly in the question. The long essay. So long essay is very similar to the free response section of the past. The difference is, in this particular case, students are going to get one long essay, but they're going to get two possible choices to do this essay. So they get two choices, they choose one, and this essay is going to be based upon the following. Either they will end up doing comparison and contrast, cause and effect, change in continuity, or periodization. Now, when you think about it, and when I first learned about this, I got a little concerned because this really offers 4 possible essays you have to teach the students. That seemed like a lot to have to do during the year, especially since they're going to have practice afterwards. But what I noticed over time is that it really narrows down to just 2 categories. Either an essay is going to be comparison and contrast or change over time. So if you teach your students, like we did in the past in AP World History, how to do comparison and contrast, how to do change in continuity over time, you really are addressing all 4 of these possibilities. There's some minor differences between them, and we'll talk about them in future PowerPoints, but it's really minor differences of language and how to approach each one of these in focus. But really, if you're teaching what we used to teach, comparison and contrast, change in continuity over time, you're basically addressing all the possible essays they could get. So the scoring for the long essay. Students must have a thesis that addresses the question and thinking skill. They must use the higher order thinking skill it's being asked for. So if they're asked for a comparison and contrast, they have to do this in their paragraphs, not just in the thesis. And as you guys know from the past, there is no such thing as double dipping. So they can't do the thinking skill in the thesis and expect to get the point both for the thesis and for the higher order thinking skills in the paragraph. The students must have historical support or evidence. And then the students must provide a synthesis. And we've talked about what they can do with synthesis, and in the future PowerPoints we're going to talk about how to teach this as well. So, some takeaways to think about these changes that are taking place in AP World History. First of all, please remember the new test is really not that different from what you've been doing in the past. You just have to be more conscious of each of the things you're doing and teach these skills to the students. So you really need to focus on the higher order thinking skills and the themes. Remember that examples are no longer meant to be a stacking up of examples and facts that the kids have to memorize, but really that the examples are illustrative of the big ideas. You want to teach the students to use context to decode questions, and especially when it comes to the DBQ, they're not summarizing or paraphrasing, they're providing context to decode DBQ documents.